They called it a divine miracle. Dozens of nuns in a locked convent suddenly pregnant. By angels. The bishop didn't scream sin, he screamed saint. But when the holy infants were born, they didn't cry. They were silent. And the walls began to smell. Why did the church encourage a lie that turned a sanctuary into a graveyard? In the suffocating stillness of the deep night, in the year 1348, a sound tore through the thick stone walls of a remote convent in northern Italy, shattering the sacred silence that the order had maintained for centuries. It was not the familiar, mournful chanting of vespers, nor was it the sharp cry of a woman succumbing to the pestilence that was beginning to ravage the world outside. This was a scream that defied the pious vocabulary of the novitiate, a raw and guttural eruption that caused the young sisters to bolt upright in their freezing dormitories, their hearts hammering against their ribs as they clutched their coarse wool blankets for protection against an invisible evil they could feel but not name. The echoes of that cry lingered in the vaulted corridors like a physical presence, distinct from the usual sounds of suffering that permeated medieval life. To the innocent ears of the teenage novices, who had been sequestered from the world before they truly knew it, the noise was a terrifying riddle. It carried the pitch of agony, suggesting a soul being torn from the body, yet it was laced with a disturbing undercurrent of wild, rhythmic triumph that made their own bodies tense with an instinctive, forbidden recognition. They pressed their hands over their ears, praying to the Virgin for deliverance, while the older nuns, those who remembered the world of men, lay awake with their eyes wide open, recognizing the sound of a battle that was not entirely spiritual. Down the long, drafty hallway, the abbess moved with a speed that belied her age, the heavy iron keys at her waist clinking a sharp rhythm against the stone floor. In her hand, a single beeswax candle sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist into demonic shapes against the damp plaster. She knew exactly which cell the disturbance was coming from, for Sister Benedetta had long been a source of both divine inspiration and administrative anxiety. The air grew heavier as the abbess approached the wooden door, the temperature seeming to rise, carrying with it a scent that had no place in the house of God, a thick, musky odor that overwhelmed the smell of incense and stale straw. When the heavy oak door was finally thrown open, the flickering candlelight revealed a tableau that would have sent a weaker woman fleeing into the night. Sister Benedetta lay upon the freezing flagstones, her body contorted in an arch so extreme it seemed her spine might snap under the pressure of some invisible hand. Her habit was in disarray, torn at the shoulder and hiked up above her knees, exposing skin that flushed with a feverish heat in the biting winter air. Her head was thrown back, her eyes rolled up into her skull so that only the whites showed, and her mouth hung open in a silent, gasping pant, as if she had just finished running a great distance or fighting for her very life against a predator. The abbess stood frozen on the threshold, her sharp gaze taking in details that contradicted the sanctity of the moment. There was no glowing apparition, no choir of seraphim descending through the ceiling, yet the room felt crowded, occupied by a lingering energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. The scent was undeniable now, it was the smell of sulfur, which the church taught was the perfume of hell, but beneath it lay the sharp, undeniable tang of male sweat and the distinct, earthly aroma of physical exertion. The shadows in the corners of the small cell seemed to retreat, or perhaps something, or someone, had just slipped away into the darkness, leaving only the wreckage of the encounter behind on the cold floor. Slowly, the convulsions racking Benedetta's body began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering trembling that looked like the aftermath of a seizure. She turned her head toward the light, her eyes focusing slowly, filled with a terrifying mix of exhaustion and beatific joy. In a hoarse whisper that barely carried across the room, she proclaimed that she had not been attacked, but chosen. She spoke of an angel, a beautiful and terrible seraph named Splenditello, who had descended from the heavens to physically open her heart and replace it with the burning heart of Jesus Christ himself. She claimed the pain was the fire of divine love, a physical intrusion of the Holy Spirit into her mortal flesh. However, the abbess was a woman of the world who had managed the convent's finances and politics for 30 years, and she looked not at Benedetta's glowing face, but at the bruising forming on her inner thighs and the scratches on her neck. These were not the marks of a spiritual epiphany, they were the violent signatures of human grasp and carnal desperation. The abbess realized with a sinking dread that the intruder had been flesh and blood, perhaps a gardener who had scaled the wall or a priest who had abused the privilege of the confessional. But to admit this out loud was to invite the Inquisition to burn the convent to the ground and disperse the sisters in disgrace, leaving them to starve on the roads. The dilemma that formed in the abbess's mind in those few seconds was cold and calculating, weighing the eternal soul against temporal survival. If she accused Benedetta of breaking her vows with a man, the scandal would destroy them all. The Church had no mercy for brides of Christ who took earthly lovers. But if she accepted the lie, if she validated the claim that this violence was a divine visitation, she would be committing a heresy of a different kind, one that required a complex web of deceit. She would have to certify that the sweat of a man was the odor of sanctity and that the bruises of rough passion were the stigmata of a saint. This was the dangerous precipice upon which the convent now stood, teetering between damnation and canonization. The concept of the incubus, a demon that assaults women in their sleep, was real enough in the theology of the time to provide a potential explanation, but Benedetta was claiming something far more potent, a celestial union. By framing the assault as a visitation from an angel, the nun had instinctively found the only narrative that could save her life. It was a brilliant, blasphemous defense mechanism, transforming her from a sinner into a visionary, effectively daring the church hierarchy to challenge the will of heaven. The abbess stepped into the room and closed the door firmly behind her, shutting out the prying eyes of the terrified novices who had gathered at the end of the hall. In that moment, a silent pact was sealed between the superior and the subordinate, a conspiracy of silence that would require the fabrication of miracles to sustain. The abbess knelt beside the panting woman, not to comfort her, but to inspect the evidence and decide how best to stage the next act of this holy drama. She pulled the torn fabric of the habit down to cover Benedetta's legs, a gesture that was less about modesty and more about concealing the crime scene. Within the stone walls of the convent, where hundreds of women lived in a state of chronic sensory deprivation and starvation, the line between hallucination and reality was already dangerously thin. The abbess knew that once the sun rose, the story of the angel would spread like wildfire through the dormitory, igniting the imaginations of women who had been taught that their bodies were battlegrounds for the soul. If she denied the miracle, she risked a riot of hysteria. If she endorsed it, she invited the scrutiny of Rome. She looked at Benedetta, who was now weeping softly, a mixture of trauma and relief, and realized that the only way forward was to embrace the impossible. Thus began the great deception, born not of malice but of the desperate need to survive in a world where women had no voice unless they borrowed the voice of God. The abbess placed a hand on Benedetta's feverish forehead and declared that they must pray for discernment, effectively validating the possibility of the vision. In doing so, she unwittingly opened the floodgates for a contagion of mysticism that would soon infect every soul in the order. The cry that had woken the convent was not the end of the night's terror, but the opening note of a tragedy that would spiral into madness, drawing in priests, bishops, and eventually, the executioners. In an era when the female form was viewed with deep and systemic suspicion by the ecclesiastical authorities, the woman was defined primarily by her potential for destruction. She was the daughter of Eve, the temptress who had collapsed the gates of paradise, and her body was regarded as a dangerous vessel of sin, a portal through which the devil might enter the world of men. To control this inherent wickedness, the medieval world built high walls of stone and silence, creating the convent not merely as a sanctuary for prayer, but as a prison for the containment of female sexuality. Within this theological framework, a woman's natural desires were not biological imperatives but evidence of corruption, requiring constant vigilance, starvation, and mortification to suppress the beast that supposedly lived beneath her skin. For thousands of young women across Europe, the convent was not a calling but a sentence passed down by the economics of the nobility. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the price of a dowry suitable for a high-born marriage had risen to ruinous levels, forcing aristocratic fathers to make cold calculations regarding their offspring. While the eldest daughter might be married off to secure a political alliance, the younger sisters were often deemed surplus, financial liabilities that needed to be stored away where they would not drain the family coffers. Dragged from their homes often before they had reached puberty, these girls were stripped of their silks and velvets, their hair was shorn close to the scalp, and they were locked behind iron grills, destined never to see the outside world again. The psychological impact of this forced incarceration created a pressure cooker of repressed emotion and sensory deprivation that the church was ill-equipped to manage. These were women of noble blood, raised on the songs of troubadours and the romances of courtly love, suddenly plunged into a world of absolute sensory monotony. The convent offered a landscape of grey stone, rough wool, and meager food, where silence was mandatory and the only authorized conversation was with God. Yet, the human need for connection and the biological drive for intimacy could not be extinguished by a vow. Instead, they were forced underground, twisting and mutating in the darkness of the mind until they found a new, permissible outlet. In this environment of starvation, both literal and emotional, the figure of Jesus Christ ceased to be merely a savior and transformed into the ultimate object of romantic and physical fixation. The iconography of the period contributed heavily to this shift, as the art of the late Middle Ages began to emphasize the human beauty and suffering of the Messiah. Crucifixes displayed a nearly naked, muscular man in the throes of passion and agony, his body twisted and bleeding, offering a visceral focal point for the nun's unspent affection. For a woman who would never know the touch of a husband, the broken body of Christ became the recipient of all her tenderness, her pity, and inevitably, her latent desire. The concept of the mystical marriage provided the theological bridge that allowed this sublimation to occur without accusations of heresy. The Church taught that a nun was a sponsa Christi, a bride of Christ, a title that carried with it intense emotional weight. In the solitude of the cell, this metaphor was often taken to its literal extreme, where prayer became a dialogue between lovers rather than a petition to a deity. The language of the mystics from this period is drenched in erotic imagery, speaking of penetration by the divine light, and the sweet wounds of love, blurring the line between spiritual ecstasy and orgasmic release so thoroughly that modern observers can scarcely tell them apart. It was in the dead of night, during the long, grueling vigils required by the monastic rule, that the boundaries of reality began to dissolve for these exhausted women. Sleep deprivation, combined with prolonged fasting, induced a state of altered consciousness where the mind projected its deepest hungers onto the empty air. Chroniclers of the time report epidemic levels of visions within convents, where nuns would claim to feel the physical weight of an invisible body pressing down upon them. They described hands stroking their hair, warm breath against their necks, and a presence that filled the room with a heat that defied the winter chill of the dormitory. To the medieval mind, these sensations were not hallucinations but tangible proof of contact with the spiritual realm, though the nature of that spirit was always in question. A nun might fall to the floor in the middle of the choir, her body rigid and trembling, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Her sisters would gather around, not in skepticism but in a mixture of terror and envy, witnessing what they believed to be a divine visitation. The convulsing woman became a conduit, a lightning rod for the supernatural, and her incoherent cries were interpreted as messages from the beyond. This collective belief system reinforced the behavior. The more dramatic the vision, the more status the visionary was accorded within the hierarchy of the convent. However, the distinction between a holy vision and a demonic assault was perilously thin, often depending entirely on the narrative the woman constructed after the event. If the invisible visitor brought pain and fear, it was a demon testing her faith; if it brought sweetness and ecstasy, it was the Lord or an angel rewarding her devotion. Yet, the physical manifestations of these encounters often bore a striking resemblance to sexual climax. Observers noted the flushing of the chest, the rapid breathing, and the arching of the spine, all of which were categorized under the broad umbrella of religious fervor. The Church, in its attempt to elevate the spirit, had inadvertently fetishized the suffering body, creating a loop where pleasure could only be acknowledged if it was disguised as pain or divine intervention. This atmosphere of hysterical contagion meant that a single visionary could trigger a domino effect throughout the entire community. If one sister claimed that the archangel Gabriel visited her bed to whisper secrets of the apocalypse, soon 3 others would claim similar intimations. It became a competitive spirituality, a desperate bid for attention in a life devoid of individual recognition. But beneath the performance lay a profound tragedy. These were women starving for touch, inventing phantom lovers because real ones were forbidden on pain of eternal damnation and earthly execution. The invisible hands were a psychological defense mechanism, a way to survive the crushing loneliness of a life without intimacy. But the realm of the spirit collided violently with the realm of biology when these nocturnal visitations began to have lasting physical consequences. The fragile equilibrium of the convent was shattered when a nun, who had ostensibly lived in perfect chastity, ceased to have her monthly bleeding and watched in horror as her belly began to swell. In a closed community where privacy was non-existent, the changes in a woman's body could not be hidden for long. The harsh wool of the habit could conceal the early signs, but the morning sickness, the fatigue, and the eventual undeniable changing of the silhouette presented a crisis that prayer alone could not solve. This was the terrifying moment where the fantasy had to be weaponized to prevent a catastrophe. A pregnancy in a convent was not merely a sin, it was a crime that threatened the social standing of the nun's aristocratic family and the financial privileges of the order. The initial reaction was often panic and concealment, with tight lacing and dangerous herbal concoctions administered in secret to induce a miscarriage. But when the life within refused to be extinguished, the narrative had to shift. A woman could not simply admit to unlatching the postern gate for a stable boy or succumbing to the advances of the father confessor. Such a confession would lead to the vade in pace, being walled up alive in a subterranean cell to die of thirst and darkness. Therefore, the vision had to be retroactively edited to explain the impossible condition of the visionary. The vague, invisible touches of the past months were reinterpreted as part of a grander, more concrete design by the powers above. The nun would claim that the visitation had not been merely spiritual, but that the angel or spirit had possessed the power of generation. This was a theological minefield, as the church debated heavily whether spirits, lacking physical bodies, could procreate. Yet, faced with the undeniable reality of a pregnant belly, the concept of the incubus, a demon capable of stealing seed from men and depositing it in women, offered a convenient, if terrifying, explanation. The logic of this defense relied on the deep-seated medieval belief that the barrier between the natural and supernatural worlds was porous. If God could impregnate the Virgin Mary with a word, why could a powerful demon, or a deceptive spirit masquerading as an angel, not effect a similar miracle on a lesser scale? The pregnant nun would thus transform her narrative from one of active sin to passive victimhood. She had not sought out a lover, she had been overpowered by a supernatural force while she lay helpless in her cell. This story, as wild as it sounds to the modern ear, was often the only shield available against the brutal justice of the ecclesiastical courts. It required a tremendous amount of nerve to maintain such a lie in the face of inquisitors who were trained to sniff out heresy. The woman had to perform the role of the bewildered vessel perfectly, combining the innocence of a victim with the conviction of a witness to the impossible. She had to describe the light that filled the room, the paralyzing force that held her down, and the strange, cold nature of the seed that was planted within her. In doing so, she was tapping into a rich vein of folklore and fear that permeated the medieval consciousness, using the church's own dogmas about the reality of demons to protect herself from the church's punishment. These deceptions were rarely solitary endeavors, they often required the complicity of the abbess or other sisters who understood the stakes. To admit that a man had breached the cloister was to admit a failure of security and discipline that could lead to the dissolution of the house. Thus, the collective delusion was reinforced. The other nuns would claim to have seen strange lights under the door or heard the beating of giant wings in the corridor on the night of the alleged conception. The pregnancy became a communal secret, wrapped in layers of mystical jargon, protecting the convent's reputation by sacrificing the truth to a fabricated miracle. The tragic irony of this situation was that the very biology that condemned them was used to validate their spiritual status. A swelling stomach, clearly the result of human frailty, was paraded as a divine tumor or a blessed burden placed there by a celestial entity. Medical examinations of the time were primitive and often conducted by men who were as superstitious as they were educated. If a woman screamed that the touch of the examiner burned her like holy fire, or if she spoke in tongues during the inspection, the doctor might well conclude that the cause was indeed beyond his earthly science. Ultimately, this phenomenon revealed the desperate creativity of the oppressed. Locked away from the world, denied the fundamental human rights of love and family, these women built a fantasy world so potent that it eventually bled into reality. The mystical marriage began as a metaphor for spiritual devotion, but under the crushing weight of isolation, it evolved into a complex psychological and social mechanism. It was a survival strategy that allowed the forbidden to happen, provided it was dressed in the robes of the miraculous, turning the shameful evidence of a broken vow into a terrifying testament of being chosen by the forces of the unseen world. At this precise intersection of theology and survival, the stage of history welcomes its most bizarre and effective legal defense, the supernatural alibi. For a woman trapped within the stone confines of a convent, the discovery of a pregnancy or a clandestine affair was not merely a scandal, it was a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. If a nun were to confess that she had unlatched her window for a handsome stable hand, or worse, that she had succumbed to the advances of the monastery's chaplain, she faced a fate of absolute horror. The punishment for breaking the vow of chastity was often the vade in pace, to be walled up alive in a tiny niche of the cellar, left to suffocate or starve in total darkness while the daily offices were sung in the chapel above. However, the medieval mind provided a loophole, a terrifying but navigable escape route through the very superstitions that governed their lives. If that same woman, facing the inquisitor's cold stare, claimed that she had been paralyzed in her sleep and ravaged by a dark, smoky entity, the narrative shifted instantly. She ceased to be a criminal who had betrayed her bridegroom, Christ, and transformed into a victim on the front lines of a spiritual war. This was the birth of the incubus defense, a desperate gamble where a woman had to vividly describe a sexual assault by a demon to avoid execution for consensual sex with a man. It was a high-stakes performance that required not just lying, but the construction of a consistent, theologically sound reality. The alternative to the dark narrative of the incubus was the blindingly bright, yet equally dangerous, story of angelic visitation. Some nuns, perhaps those with a more narcissistic bent or those whose lovers were high-ranking ecclesiastics, chose to claim that their visitor was not a beast from the pit, but a messenger from heaven. They would describe a beautiful youth who came to them in a cloud of gold dust, claiming that God desired a new lineage or a special union. This was an even riskier path, for it skirted the edges of blasphemy and required the nun to possess a charisma that could convince her superiors of her own holiness. Yet, if successful, it offered not just survival, but power, the power of a living saint whose womb held a miracle rather than a bastard. Entering the ecclesiastical courts of the 14th century, one would find them overwhelmed with these bizarre testimonies, a surplus of supernatural paternity suits. The atmosphere in these tribunals was thick with fear and fascination, as grim-faced clerics listened to young women recount graphic details of nocturnal visitations. To make the story stick, the accused had to perform her trauma, she could not simply state facts. She had to weep, to tremble, to foam at the mouth, simulating the aftershocks of a brush with the infernal. The judges looked for specific markers of demonic contact, the unnatural coldness of the entity's skin, the smell of sulfur, and the paralyzing weight that made screaming impossible until the act was done. It is here that we encounter the central paradox of the medieval church's relationship with sexuality and power. Logic suggests that the church should have been the most skeptical of these claims, exposing them as transparent covers for human frailty. Yet, the institutional church found itself in a position where believing the lie was far more advantageous than uncovering the truth. To admit that a convent was a hotbed of fornication, where priests and nuns engaged in rampant sexual activity, was to undermine the moral authority of the entire clergy. It would suggest that the vow of celibacy was a farce and that the men of God were no better than the peasants they preached to. On the other hand, validating the story of the incubus reinforced the church's essential worldview. It confirmed that the devil was real, that he was physically active in the world, and that he was obsessed with corrupting the most holy of sanctuaries. By accepting the nun's claim of demonic rape, the church could position itself not as a failed disciplinarian, but as a necessary fortress against the encroaching darkness. The pregnant nun was no longer proof of clerical corruption, she was proof of the spiritual danger that surrounded them all. The demonic pregnancy became a useful propaganda tool, terrifying the faithful into stricter obedience and greater reliance on the sacraments for protection. This alignment of interests created a grotesque symbiosis between the accused women and their judges. The inquisitor needed a demon to fight, and the nun needed a demon to blame. Thus, the interrogation room became a collaborative storytelling workshop, where the details of the assault were refined until they fit the prevailing theological textbooks. The woman might start with a vague story of a shadow, but under the leading questions of the priest, did he feel cold? Was his voice like a scraping stone? Did he vanish in smoke? She would learn exactly what to say to save her life. She provided the monster, and he provided the validation. The role of the actual human lovers in this charade adds another layer of dark irony to the history. Often, the man responsible for the pregnancy was the very confessor to whom the nun was supposed to reveal her soul. These men, trapped in their own vows of celibacy, frequently coached their mistresses on how to frame the narrative. A priest who had impregnated a nun had every reason to support the incubus theory, for it saved him from the stake as surely as it saved her. He would step forward as a witness, claiming to have sensed a foul presence in the cloister or to have found the nun in a trance state, effectively using his spiritual authority to cover his carnal tracks. But the alibi required more than just a story, it required a pseudoscientific explanation for the resulting child. Medieval theology wrestled mightily with the mechanics of how a spirit, which has no physical body, could produce biological offspring. The accepted theory, cemented by scholars like Thomas Aquinas, was disturbingly clinical. They posited that a demon acts first as a succubus, lying with a man to steal his seed, and then transforms into an incubus to deposit that stolen vitality into a woman. This convoluted explanation served a crucial purpose, it maintained the definition of the demon as a non-living entity while explaining the undeniable flesh and blood of the infant. This theological gymnastics had horrific consequences for the children born of these unions. If the mother's story was accepted, the child was officially branded a product of witchcraft. These infants were often described as changelings, born with deformities or an unnatural, sullen temperament. In reality, many were likely healthy babies, but the narrative demanded they be monsters. They were often quietly disposed of, sent to remote orphanages, or allowed to fail to thrive in the harsh conditions of the convent infirmary. Their very existence was a piece of evidence that had to be neutralized to maintain the mother's delicate fiction of victimhood. The prevalence of this defense mechanism suggests a society in a state of deep psychological fracture. We must imagine the mental state of a woman who has to look at her own newborn and declare it a monster in order to avoid being burned alive. The dissociation required to survive such a lie is immense. These women had to compartmentalize their lives so severely that many likely began to believe their own fabrications. The stress of the deception, combined with the isolation and religious intensity of the convent, could easily induce genuine hallucinations, making the lie a self-fulfilling prophecy where the dreamer can no longer distinguish between the lover's touch and the demon's claw. Furthermore, the incubus alibi created a contagion of hysteria that could sweep through a convent like the plague. Once one sister successfully used the defense to explain a pregnancy or an illicit encounter, it opened the door for others. Suddenly, entire wings of a monastery would report being plagued by night terrors. It became a collective delusion, a way for the community to express sexual frustration and guilt without accepting personal responsibility. If everyone is under attack by demons, then no one is individually guilty of lust. The mass possession became a shield behind which the entire community could hide its secrets. The church authorities, while often complicit, were not entirely naive. There were skeptics who saw through the charade, yet they were often silenced by the political risks of exposure. To denounce a popular visionary or a victim of high noble birth was to invite the wrath of her powerful family. It was far safer to conduct an exorcism than a criminal trial. The ritual of exorcism itself became a form of theater that satisfied everyone. The nun was center stage, receiving attention and pity, the priest looked powerful and commanding, and the public was awed by the visible battle between good and evil. However, playing this game with the Inquisition was akin to dancing on the edge of a razor. The line between being a victim of a demon and being a witch who voluntarily copulated with one was determined entirely by the mood of the judge. If the inquisitor decided that the nun had enjoyed the encounter, or if she failed to show sufficient horror, the classification shifted from oppression to witchcraft. The same story that could save her life could also be the evidence used to condemn her to the flames. It was a terrifying gamble where the woman had to constantly calibrate her performance to the prejudices of the men judging her. By the late medieval period, this dynamic had established a disturbing precedent in the legal and religious history of Europe. It solidified the idea that women were the primary targets of the devil because of their weaker nature, a concept that would fuel the great witch hunts of the coming centuries. The alibi that saved individual nuns contributed to a massive cultural misogyny, reinforcing the belief that the female body was a porous border through which evil entered the world. Every time a nun successfully claimed an incubus attack, she added another brick to the pyre that would eventually burn thousands of laywomen accused of the same crime. Ultimately, the phenomenon of the incubus defense reveals the profound distortions caused by the suppression of human nature. In a world where love was criminalized and biology was denied, the human drive for connection was forced to don a monstrous mask. The demonic sex was, in many cases, simply human intimacy criminalized and then repackaged as supernatural horror. The church, in its effort to police the bedroom, created a world where the only safe way to admit to having sex was to claim it was raped by a monster from hell. This twisted logic reached its apex when the alibi became more real than the truth. Narratives from the time described nuns who, even on their deathbeds, stuck to the story of the angel or the demon. They had lived the lie for so long that it had become their identity. The fiction protected them from the crushing weight of their reality, allowing them to die as martyrs of a spiritual war rather than as women who had simply dared to love in a loveless place. The ideal alibi was effective not because it was believable, but because it was necessary for the survival of everyone involved. However, the seasoned investigators of the Holy Inquisition were anything but naive simpletons easily swayed by tearful tales of celestial visitations. These were men of cold, forensic intellect, trained in the rigorous universities of Paris and Bologna, where they learned that the devil was indeed a deceiver, but that human beings were far more prolific liars. They approached each case of reported mysticism with a skepticism that bordered on cynicism, understanding that the line between a saint and a heretic often depended on political convenience and physical evidence. When they arrived at a convent, They did not bring merely prayers and holy water, they brought a terrifying bureaucratic machinery designed to dismantle the human spirit and lay bare the secrets of the flesh. The arrival of the inquisitorial entourage marked the end of the convent's autonomy and the beginning of a brutal dismantling of its private life. The procedure of inquiry, legally known as the Inquisitio, rapidly devolved into a sophisticated and deeply humiliating medical examination that stripped the accused nuns of every shred of modesty. The central theater for this investigation was often the convent's own chapter house or infirmary, transformed into a makeshift interrogation chamber where the sacred and the obscene would mingle freely. Here, the nun was forced to disrobe completely, standing shivering on the cold stones, surrounded by a tribunal that viewed her nakedness not as a vulnerability to be protected, but as a text to be read for signs of infernal copulation. The atmosphere was thick with a voyeuristic tension, legitimized by the high stakes of saving a soul, yet unmistakably predatory in its execution. To conduct the physical inspections, the inquisitors employed specially sworn midwives, older women whose task was to handle the accused body while the men in robes watched from a severe distance, their eyes narrowing in judgment. These midwives were instructed to search for the stigmata diaboli, the devil's marks, which were believed to be the physical stamp of Satan's ownership upon his servants. The theology of the time dictated that when the devil made a pact with a human, he left a permanent token on the skin, a spot that was utterly insensitive to pain and did not bleed when pierced. This belief turned the examination into an agonizing game of cartography, where every mole, scar, or birthmark became a potential death warrant. The tools of this grim trade were long, thin needles or bodkins, often consecrated with holy water to prevent the devil from hiding the mark through illusion. The midwives would systematically prick the accused woman's body, starting from the extremities and moving inward to the most intimate crevices of her anatomy. The room would be silent save for the scratching of the scribe's quill and the sharp intakes of breath or cries of pain from the woman being tested. The scribe meticulously recorded every reaction. A flinch was noted as a sign of humanity, while a moment of shock-induced silence or a failure to bleed immediately was seized upon as evidence of a demonic pact. The cruelty of the process was such that the trauma often induced a state of dissociation, causing the very numbness the inquisitors were hunting for. Yet, as these invasive procedures dragged on, the investigators frequently stumbled upon evidence that pointed away from the supernatural and directly toward the mundane corruption of the clergy. The medical exams would reveal not the claw marks of a beast, but the undeniable signs of human roughness, bruises consistent with restraint by human hands, or the specific tearing associated with non-consensual or rough human intercourse. The demonic seed, described by the nuns, often turned out to have the mundane consistency of human fluid, and the timing of the pregnancies aligned perfectly with the visitation schedules of the convent's confessors. The facade of the incubus began to crumble, revealing a predator that did not need to vanish in a puff of smoke because he held the keys to the front gate. It became increasingly clear to the astute minds of the Inquisition that the role of the demon was frequently played by the very men charged with the spiritual protection of the flock. The confessional box, designed as a vessel for divine forgiveness, had been weaponized into a tool of grooming and procurement. In the dark, whispered intimacy of the confessional, priests would slowly erode the moral boundaries of their penitents, twisting theology to serve their lust. They would suggest to the isolated, impressionable nuns that their beauty was a trial sent by God and that the only way to conquer the flesh was to submit to it fully, thereby mortifying the spirit through the shame of the act. This was a grand and monstrous con, a spiritual Ponzi scheme where the priest positioned himself as the necessary conduit for a holy sin. The investigators uncovered letters and diaries revealing how confessors had convinced women that they were mystical wives, and that the priest was merely acting as the physical proxy for Christ or an angel. By framing the sexual act as a secret sacrament, the predator absolved the victim of guilt before the sin was even committed. The priest would whisper that true purity lay in the intention of the soul, not the actions of the body, and that by yielding to him, the nun was practicing the ultimate form of obedience and humility. The intellectual manipulation required to sustain this deception was profound. The director of conscience, as the spiritual guide was known, held absolute power over the nun's perception of reality. If she resisted his advances, he could threaten her with spiritual abandonment, claiming that her refusal was a sign of pride and a rejection of God's will. He could deny her the Eucharist, the very center of her existence, until she capitulated. Thus, the sexual abuse was inextricably linked to spiritual abuse. The woman was not just raped in body, but coerced in soul, led to believe that her degradation was a rung on the ladder to heaven. In some of the most egregious cases uncovered by the tribunals, it was revealed that priests had actually donned costumes to enact the role of the supernatural visitor. In the flickering candlelight of a cell, a man in white robes with attached wings could easily pass for the Archangel Gabriel to a sleep-deprived girl desperate for a miracle. These theatrical intrusions were often accompanied by the use of rudimentary narcotics or incense laced with hallucinogenic herbs, ensuring that the victim's memory of the event remained dreamlike and fragmented. The cynical calculation behind such acts stunned even the inquisitors, who were accustomed to the banality of evil but unprepared for such elaborate staging of sacrilege. The scandal was compounded by the realization that this was rarely the work of a lone wolf, it was a systemic rot facilitated by the culture of silence. High-ranking abbots and bishops were often found to be aware of these mystical activities, turning a blind eye as long as the convent remained profitable and the families of the nuns remained placated. The angelic visitation was a convenient fiction that allowed everyone to save face. The priest got his pleasure, the nun got a status boost as a visionary, and the church avoided the embarrassment of admitting that its walls could not keep out the basic drives of human nature. However, when the Inquisition decided to pull the thread, the entire tapestry unraveled with catastrophic consequences. The interrogation of the priests revealed a terrifying arrogance. Many of them did not even view themselves as sinners, but as enlightened practitioners of a higher, esoteric Christianity reserved for the elect. They argued to the tribunal that they were liberating the nuns from the stifling constraints of the law, ushering them into an era of freedom of the spirit. This heresy, often linked to the Brethren of the Free Spirit, claimed that once a soul was united with God, it could no longer sin, no matter what the body did. For the nuns, the realization that their divine union was merely the sordid exploitation of a lecherous cleric was a psychological blow that shattered their minds. The inquisitors, in their relentless pursuit of truth, forced these women to confront the reality that they had not been the brides of angels, but the concubines of liars. The collapse of the fantasy left them with nothing. They were no longer saints, but they were also spoiled as brides of Christ. The emotional devastation was often so absolute that the accused women would collapse into catatonic states, unable to reconcile the beautiful lie they had lived with the ugly truth now written in the scribe's ledger. The devil's mark thus became a metaphor for the investigation itself. The inquisitors were looking for a supernatural scar, but what they found was the imprint of institutional power abusing the vulnerable. The needles that pierced the skin of the nuns were seeking a lack of sensation, but the entire system relied on the emotional numbness of women conditioned to accept abuse as a form of piety. The grand spiritual affair was exposed as a mechanism of control, where the fear of the devil was used to drive women into the arms of the very men who preached against him. Ultimately, the medical examinations and the aggressive interrogations served to demystify the supernatural epidemic, but in doing so, they indicted the church itself. The findings were so damaging that they were often sealed in the secret archives, the specific details suppressed to prevent a popular uprising against the clergy. The official narrative would often revert to the safer story of demonic possession, for it was better to have the faithful fear a phantom devil than to have them despise a very real, predatory priesthood. The lie of the incubus was maintained not just by the nuns, but by the institution that prosecuted them, for the truth was too monstrous to be allowed into the light of day. By the arrival of the 15th century, the isolated whispers of the past had metastasized into a roaring epidemic of collective madness that threatened to consume the very foundations of monastic life. What had begun as the desperate defense of individual women had evolved into a synchronized theater of hysteria, where entire convents would descend into chaos simultaneously. Travelers passing near these high-walled compounds would report hearing a cacophony of shrieks and guttural groans that sounded less like a house of prayer and more like a battlefield of the damned. Inside, the scene was one of contagion. If one sister fell to the floor claiming to see the burning eyes of a demon, 3 others would immediately collapse in sympathy, their bodies writhing in a mimicry of possession that was both terrifying and strangely competitive. This mass psychosis was not merely a random outbreak of mental illness but a complex social phenomenon driven by the intense pressure of the cloistered environment. In a world where individuality was crushed under the heel of the rule, the only way to achieve distinction was through the magnitude of one's suffering. The nuns, starved of sensory input and emotional release, found in these communal seizures a way to express the inexpressible. They would foam at the mouth, speak in tongues, and contort their limbs into impossible shapes, creating a spectacle that was at once a rebellion against their confinement and a desperate plea for attention. The possession became a dark status symbol, a twisted proof that the convent was a battleground where the forces of darkness were actively warring against the extreme holiness of the inhabitants. However, behind this curtain of supernatural terror stood the figure of the abbess, who was often less a spiritual mother and more a pragmatic CEO of a failing enterprise. These women, usually drawn from the high nobility, understood the brutal economics of the medieval church. A quiet convent was a poor convent. In an age where relics and miracles were the primary drivers of religious tourism, a house that could boast of a direct line to the spiritual realm attracted pilgrims, and pilgrims brought silver. The abbess, staring at the crumbling masonry and the empty larder, faced a choice between obscurity and infamy. Many chose the latter, subtly encouraging the rumors that their monastery was a holy battleground, effectively marketing the hysteria to a fascinated and fearful public. The cynicism required to maintain this charade was breathtaking in its scope. The superiors of these houses would write frantic letters to bishops and local dukes, detailing the assaults their daughters were enduring, pleading for funds to buy holy oil, candles, and masses of exorcism. Yet, in the privacy of their own solar, they turned a blind eye to the mundane reality that fueled the fantasy. They knew perfectly well that the spirits haunting the dormitories did not float through stone walls or materialize from sulphurous smoke. These nocturnal visitors entered through the heavy oak doors, and they did so because they possessed the iron keys, duplicates often provided by the very authorities meant to guard the sanctity of the enclosure. The architecture of the convent, designed to keep the world out, had become a sieve through which the local clergy and nobility filtered at will. The demon was often the local bishop's nephew, or a generously donating patron, or the father confessor who held the spiritual keys to the kingdom of heaven. The abbess, acting as the gatekeeper, would facilitate these liaisons under the guise of spiritual direction or comforting the afflicted. It was a grand masquerade where the sexual exploitation of the nuns was rebranded as a spiritual trial. The noise of the nightly battles with the devil served as a convenient acoustic cover for the sounds of illicit encounters, allowing the entire community to participate in a conspiracy of denial. But the most audacious and blasphemous chapter of this history opened when the consequences of these unions could no longer be hidden beneath a habit. In the 15th century, the deception escalated to a level that dared to mock the central mystery of the Christian faith itself, the virgin birth. When a nun found herself with child, and the usual remedies of routine and tight lacing failed, the convent leadership sometimes opted for a strategy of absolute defiance. They would declare that the pregnancy was not the result of sin, but a repetition of the miracle of Nazareth. The sister was not a fallen woman, she was a new vessel chosen by the Holy Spirit, her womb quickened not by men but by a divine mandate to bring forth a holy prophet or a saint for these end times. This gamble relied on the immense credulity of the age and the desperate hope of the faithful for a new Messiah. The pregnant nun would be sequestered, treated with the reverence due to a living reliquary. Her swelling belly was touched by visiting dignitaries, her bathwater sold as a cure for infertility. The sheer brazenness of the lie acted as its own protection. To accuse the convent of fraud was to question the power of God to work miracles. Thus, the biological result of a sordid affair with a chaplain was elevated to the status of a divine intervention, turning a potential scandal into a lucrative attraction that filled the convent's coffers with votive offerings. However, the birth of the child presented a logistical and theological crisis that required nerves of steel to manage. If the infant was born healthy and fair, the Immaculate Conception narrative might be sustained for a short while, with the child raised within the walls as a mascot or a child oblate, destined for the priesthood from the first breath. But more often, the presence of a crying, hungry baby shattered the mystical atmosphere too violently to be sustained. The illusion of sanctity was fragile, and the undeniable humanity of an infant risked exposing the entire fraud. Therefore, a darker solution was frequently employed, one that twisted the folklore of the era into a weapon of disposal. If the child could not be kept, it was declared a changeling, a soulless husk left by the demons to mock the Holy Mother. This narrative allowed the nuns to rid themselves of the infant without technically committing murder in their own eyes, they were merely returning a monster to its maker. These unfortunate babies were often bundled into baskets and left at crossroads or on the steps of village churches in the dead of night, branded with the stigma of being devil's spawn. The villagers, terrified of the bad luck such a creature might bring, would often shun the foundling, leaving it to perish from exposure or hunger, a victim of a theological cover-up that valued the reputation of the convent over the life of a child. In other, even more macabre instances, the demon child narrative was used to explain the sudden disappearance of the infant shortly after birth. The nuns would claim that the angels had returned to claim their own, ascending to heaven with the baby before it could be corrupted by the earth. A small, empty coffin might be buried with great pomp and circumstance, while the real body was disposed of in the unconsecrated ground of the cellar or the lime pit. These secret burials bound the community together in a blood pact. Every sister who wielded a shovel or held a lantern was complicit, and their shared guilt forged a chain of silence that was stronger than any vow of poverty or obedience. The psychological toll of living within this collective delusion was catastrophic. The convent became a hall of mirrors where truth was the only heresy. Every nun knew the reality, they recognized the demon's voice as the priest's, they saw the angelic baby shivering in the cold, but to speak the truth was to destroy their entire world. If the lie collapsed, they would be cast out, stripped of their home, their status, and their souls. Thus, the deception became a survival mechanism, a shared hallucination that they fiercely protected. They reinforced each other's stories, adding embellishments and details, correcting anyone who wavered, until the lie became more real to them than the stone walls that surrounded them. This culture of complicity created a bizarre duality in their daily lives. By day, they were the brides of Christ, singing the office and tending the garden. By night, they were the players in a gothic drama of sex, birth, and death. The cognitive dissonance required to inhabit these two worlds simultaneously fractured their minds, leading to genuine breakdowns that looked, to the outside observer, exactly like the demonic possession they were feigning. The screaming fits, the tearing of hair, the sudden paralysis, these were often the authentic expressions of psyches pushed beyond the breaking point by the weight of their secrets. The local population, for their part, played a willing role in this theater. The peasants and townspeople wanted to believe in the presence of the supernatural in their midst, it made their mundane lives feel significant. A convent under siege by the devil was a terrifying neighbor, but it was also a source of local pride and economic activity. They brought food, firewood, and coins to help the sisters fight the darkness, effectively subsidizing the corruption. The local bishop, even if he suspected the truth, often calculated that a scandal would be more damaging to the church's authority than a few eccentric nuns. Silence was the currency of the realm, and everyone from the peasant to the prelate paid their dues. By the late 15th century, the situation had reached a boiling point. The convent had transformed from a sanctuary of virginity into a grotesque parody of the domestic sphere, where husbands were replaced by spirits, and children were erased by theology. The walls, intended to keep sin out, served only to lock it in, creating a pressure cooker of repressed humanity that was waiting to explode. The lies had been piled so high that they blocked out the sun, and in the darkness, the line between the sacred and the profane had vanished entirely. The spiritual aphors had become a systemic rot, a grand and tragic hustle where the quest for holiness had led to the deepest valleys of moral compromise. As the century drew to a close, the cracks in the facade began to widen. The Renaissance was bringing a new spirit of inquiry, and the old excuses were beginning to wear thin. But for the women trapped inside, there was no way out. They were prisoners of their own narrative, forced to continue the performance even as the audience began to turn away. They were the architects of a prison made of dreams and nightmares, and they held the keys, but they could no longer find the door. The stage was set for the final act, where the accumulated weight of a century of deception would come crashing down, demanding a price that could only be paid in blood and fire. The inevitable collapse of this grand, architectural deception arrived not with a whimper, but with the deafening crash of absolute moral bankruptcy. No lie, no matter how carefully constructed or religiously sanctified, can sustain the weight of reality forever, and the structural integrity of the convent's fiction began to buckle under the accumulation of physical evidence. The drama reached its terminal velocity when the sheer volume of miraculous occurrences and the resulting biological debris could no longer be contained within the silent cloisters. The tipping point was often mundane, a renovation of the foundations, a flood that washed away topsoil, or the arrival of a new, reformist bishop who was immune to the charms of the abbess. When the spade finally hit the earth, it did not strike the bedrock of faith, but the shallow graves of the inconvenient truth. In one particularly harrowing and well-documented instance from the late 15th century, the veil was torn away during the expansion of a convent's wine cellar, a project intended to increase the order's revenue. As the workmen dug into the soft, consecrated earth beneath the dormitory wing, their shovels unearthed a horror that silenced their banter and sent them fleeing in superstitious terror. There, packed into the clay-like pottery shards, were the skeletal remains of dozens of infants. These were not the respectful burials of baptized souls, but the hasty, panicked disposals of unwanted evidence. The tiny ribcages and skulls were tangled together in a mass of indiscernible humanity, a subterranean testimony to decades of angelic visitations that had ended in cold-blooded infanticide. The discovery presented the ecclesiastical authorities with a crisis of existential proportions. To admit that these were the children of the nuns and their confessors would be to admit that the monastery was little more than a brothel operating under the sign of the cross. It would shatter the authority of the church in the region and invite the wrath of the secular lords who had paid fortunes to house their daughters there. The hierarchy, faced with the undeniable bones of their own corruption, chose the only path that could preserve the institution. They doubled down on the supernatural lie. The official inquiry, convened with great pomp, declared that these were not human children at all, but the grotesque byproducts of demonic copulation. The theological spin doctors of the time went to work, weaving a narrative that was as brilliant as it was monstrous. They argued that since an incubus is a spirit without life, it cannot produce a living soul. Therefore, the offspring of such a union is a monster, a soulless husk of flesh that mimics humanity but is, in essence, a piece of hell. By categorizing the skeletons as demon spawn, the church achieved a masterstroke of propaganda. The evidence of sexual abuse was transformed into evidence of a great spiritual war. The convent was not a site of sin, but a fortress that had been under siege by the legions of Satan, and the dead infants were merely the casualties of the nuns' heroic, albeit involuntary, battles with the enemy. With the narrative framework established, the machinery of justice turned its gears toward the allocation of blame, and as always, the weight fell crushing down upon the women. The priests and bishops who had fathered these children, the men who had held the keys and the power, were swiftly effectively written out of the criminal script. The inquisitors argued that these holy men had been the victims of enchantment and glamour. The nuns, they claimed, were not merely victims of incubi, but were secret witches who had used love potions and spells to cloud the minds of their confessors, drawing them into sin against their will. The narrative inverted reality completely. The predator became the prey, and the exploited woman became the powerful seductress. The fate of the men involved in this generational scandal was a study in institutional self-preservation. There were no public floggings, no executions, and no burnings for the fathers of the demon children. Instead, they were quietly reassigned to distant parishes, often in different dioceses where their history was unknown. The church could not afford to execute its own officers and admit to the fallibility of the priesthood. These men were reprimanded for their weakness in the face of female sorcery, given a penance of prayer, and then allowed to continue their careers, their reputations tarnished but intact. They walked away from the graves of their own children, shielded by the very robes that had allowed them access to the convent in the first place. For the women, however, the sentence was designed to be as enduring as the stone walls that had imprisoned them. Since they were now classified as vessels of the demonic, polluted beyond the reach of ordinary redemption, the punishment had to be total. They were not burned at the stake, that would have been too quick, and perhaps too public. Instead, the ecclesiastical court pronounced the sentence of vade in pace, go in peace. It was a euphemism of chilling cruelty, for it meant life imprisonment in its most literal and horrific form, immurement. The nuns were to be walled up alive within the very convent they had desecrated, effectively becoming part of the architecture they had failed to transcend. The ritual of immurement was conducted with the solemnity of a funeral, a macabre piece of theater designed to terrify the faithful and seal the truth forever. The condemned nuns, often stripped of their habits and dressed in grave clothes, were led in a procession to a small, windowless cell or a niche carved deep into the foundation walls. The bishop would recite the office of the dead over them, sprinkling earth on their heads as if they were already corpses in coffins. The terror of the moment is impossible to overstate. These were women, many still young, watching their own funeral while their hearts beat wildly in their chests, fully aware that the darkness waiting for them was eternal. As the masons began their work, laying brick upon brick to seal the opening, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of chanting, drowning out the pleas of the condemned. The women were given a small loaf of bread and a flask of water, a cruel gesture that served only to prolong their suffering rather than sustain their lives. A small slit or narrow opening was sometimes left, not for escape, but to allow a sliver of air and, crucially, to allow the sounds of their repentance to be heard. The final brick was placed, cementing the woman into a tomb of absolute darkness, a space where she could neither stand up nor lie down fully, a stone womb that would become her grave. The horror of what followed inside those walls defies the capacity of language. Trapped in a space smaller than a closet, in total sensory deprivation, the nuns faced a slow, agonizing descent into madness and death. The air would grow stale and heavy, the temperature dropping to the chill of the earth. The psychological torture of the silence, broken only by the scratching of rats or the distant, muffled sounds of the liturgy being sung in the chapel, would have shattered their minds long before thirst or starvation claimed their bodies. They were erased from the world of the living, yet they were not granted the release of the dead. They existed in a liminal space of pure suffering. However, the most grotesque and ironic twist of this tragedy occurred in the months and years that followed. The design of the cells, with their narrow air vents, meant that the screams, prayers, and delirious moans of the dying women could drift out into the church and the surrounding courtyard. Instead of viewing these sounds as the cries of torture victims, the local population and the pilgrims interpreted them through the lens of the lie they had been fed. They believed they were hearing the voices of holy martyrs, who were locked in a perpetual spiritual combat with the demons that had plagued the convent. The sounds of agony were recontextualized as the sounds of spiritual warfare. When a walled-up nun screamed in the throes of starvation or madness, the faithful outside would cross themselves and whisper that she was currently wrestling with an incubus, fighting for the soul of the world. The convent, realizing the economic potential of this phenomenon, began to market the Voices of the Wall as a tourist attraction. Pilgrims traveled from miles around, paying gold and silver for the privilege of pressing their ears against the cold stone to listen to the ecstasy of the holy prisoners. The suffering of the women became a commodity, a peep show of auditory horror sold as a spiritual experience. The church, in a final act of cynical capitalism, placed collection boxes beneath the spots where the moans were loudest. They sold relics, candles, and indulgences to those who came to witness the miracle of the penitents. The very gold that paid for the masonry which entombed the women was generated by their prolonged dying. It was a closed loop of exploitation where the victim paid for her own executioner, and the public paid to watch the show. The nuns, who had been used as sexual objects by the priests, were now used as economic objects by the institution, their bodies consumed in life and their death throes consumed for profit. As the weeks turned to months, the voices in the walls inevitably grew fainter, turning from screams to whimpers, and finally to a silence that was heavier than the stone itself. Yet even then, the myth persisted. When the silence fell, the guides would tell the pilgrims that the saints had finally triumphed over the demons and had ascended to a state of silent contemplation. The physical reality of the rotting corpse behind the brick was ignored in favor of the sanitized, profitable legend. The ideal alibi had worked to perfection. It had covered up the crimes, disposed of the witnesses, and turned the scene of the atrocity into a shrine. In the end, the history of these women was not written in ink, but in the scratches of fingernails on the inside of limestone blocks. The demonic sex scandal, the incubus defense, and the mass hysteria were all symptoms of a society that had criminalized human nature to such an extent that only monsters could explain the mundane. The finalized silence of the convent walls buried the truth so deep that it would take centuries for the light to reach it again. The legacy of the incubus alibi remains a terrifying monument to the capacity of power to rewrite reality, proving that the most dangerous demons were never the ones in the stories, but the ones who held the quill, the key, and the trowel.